When an elderly woman crossed the threshold of an exclusive restaurant, nobody imagined that her serene appearance would reveal a shocking secret that would leave everyone completely silent. The evening sun bathed the large glass windows of the prestigious restaurant Le Jardin, an iconic fine dining establishment located in Boston, Massachusetts, with a warm glow. The atmosphere was filled with rhythmic whispers, the tinkling of glasses, and the soft melodies of a live pianist in the corner. It was a space where people celebrated special occasions or closed important deals, all surrounded by the splendor of elegant decor and carefully selected attire. The main door opened, and in walked an elderly African-American woman. Her steps were slow but firm, her bearing reflecting an unwavering dignity despite the years that weighed on her figure. She wore a dark gray coat with intricate embroidery on the cuffs and carried a small black handbag with confidence, exuding an air of assurance. Her serene expression radiated an imposing presence that caught the attention of several diners. The hostess greeted her with a smile that seemed barely genuine, a subtle but unmistakable gesture. "Do you have a reservation, madam?" she asked, glancing briefly over her shoulder, as if afraid of holding up the queue. "Yes, under the name Kensington," the woman replied in a firm, polite voice. The hostess checked her list, nodded, and led her to a table in a corner near the kitchen. It was far from the most comfortable spot in the restaurant. However, Mrs. Kensington made no objection. She took her seat, crossed her hands on the table, and began to read the menu. Something, however, was not right. The minutes dragged on. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his 20s named Marcus, passed by her table several times, offering her nothing more than a fleeting glance. Finally, when Marcus approached, his smile was tense, and his tone carried a hint of impatience. "Sorry for the delay," he said hurriedly. "We're quite busy right now. I'll be back in a moment to take your order." Mrs. Kensington nodded gracefully and thanked him, though she couldn't help but notice that nearby tables, occupied by younger diners dressed in casual attire, received immediate and attentive service. She also felt the weight of furtive glances. A woman 2 tables away whispered something to her companion, both casting discreet looks in her direction. Another diner frowned, as if puzzled by her presence. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. When Marcus finally returned, his demeanor remained unchanged. "I'm sorry, but we're a little short-staffed today. It might take a while to serve you," he said, his tone bordering on indifference. Mrs. Kensington's lips curved into a slight smile. "Take your time," she replied in a tone that did not betray the frustration she might have been feeling. No, she was not ready to make a scene, but the tension in the air was undeniable. As she settled back into her chair, maintaining a calm appearance, someone across the room noticed everything, their expression darkening. From her seat in the corner, Mrs. Kensington observed the room with serene composure. This was not her first encounter with such subtle mistreatment, the kind that was not overtly loud but manifested in every delayed service and disdainful glance. Even so, she remained composed, her hands resting gently on the table, as if simply passing the time. Meanwhile, Marcus continued attending to nearby tables, with a cheerful tone and a relaxed smile, taking orders and joking with other diners. Each time he passed Mrs. Kensington's table, he failed to acknowledge her presence. The discomfort among the other customers began to grow. A young couple seated in the center of the room exchanged nervous glances. "Why not that table? They've waited long enough," whispered the woman, her voice barely audible over the background music. Her companion shrugged, glancing quickly at Marcus, who remained completely indifferent. Seconds turned into minutes, and although Mrs. Kensington outwardly maintained her calm demeanor, a small part of her began to wonder how far this would go. When she tried to reach for her glass of water, she found it was empty. A few tables away, a waiter delivered a glass of chilled wine to a customer who had arrived much later than her. Finally, Marcus returned, carrying a tray of food meant for another table. As he passed Mrs. Kensington, he paused briefly. "She hasn't decided yet?" he asked, his tone verging on disdain, as if the delay were her fault. Mrs. Kensington looked at him, her eyes firm and kind but filled with a silent intensity that made him hesitate. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, her voice measured and polite. Marcus nodded, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. However, someone else had been watching closely. At a table near the bar, a man in his 60s sat with a half-empty glass of sparkling water. He was dressed impeccably in a navy blue blazer. His demeanor was calm yet sharp, and his eyes narrowed as he observed Marcus's behavior. The man had been silently taking note of every interaction, every snub, and every disdainful glance. His fingers drummed softly on the table as his expression grew colder with each passing moment. For now he remained silent, his gaze alternating between Mrs. Kensington and the staff. He was not just any customer, he was the owner of the restaurant. And Mrs. Kensington was not just any customer, she was his mother. But he was not yet ready to intervene. He wanted to see how far this would go, how Marcus would treat someone he assumed to be helpless. His jaw tensed as Marcus laughed with another table, oblivious to the storm brewing on the other side of the restaurant. The tension was mounting, and although Mrs. Kensington remained calm, the air in the restaurant grew heavier with each passing second. Something had to give, and it was only a matter of time. On the other side of the room, Aya Kensington leaned back in her chair, her fingers still rhythmically tapping the edge of the table. She was not the type to lose her temper easily. Years in the restaurant industry had taught her that patience was often the most powerful tool in her arsenal. But this was different. Seeing her mother endure subtle but deliberate mistreatment filled him with a slow, burning anger. He had chosen to put all his heart into building the restaurant. It was not just a business, it was a testament to the values his mother had instilled in him: respect, integrity, and fairness. She had been his anchor during years of struggle, the voice in his ear reminding him to keep going when everything seemed to be against him. Now, to see her treated as if she did not belong in a place that he himself had created, it felt personal. He noticed how Marcus avoided his mother's table, how he smiled effortlessly at other customers while their expressions hardened, as if they were sharing an unspoken joke. His grip tightened around his glass. The restaurant was his domain, his pride. Every detail, from the menu to the decor, bore his mark. Yet at that moment, he felt powerless. His mother was the only person in the world he would never allow to be disrespected, and there she was, putting up with it. Unable to control his thoughts, Elia wondered whether he should confront Marcus now and make an example of him in front of the whole restaurant, or whether he should wait and let the moment develop, ensuring there was no room for excuses. He chose the latter. He signaled to the manager, a middle-aged woman named Dana, who cautiously approached their table. "Keep an eye on table 12, he said to her in a low voice as Elia turned to his mother. "I want to see how Marcus handles this. Don't intervene yet." Dana hesitated, but she nodded. She knew she shouldn't question Elia when his tone was so firm. Elia turned his attention back to his mother. Now she looked at her watch, her movements deliberate and calm. She wouldn't complain. Complaints had never been her style. She believed in letting actions speak louder than words. But Elia also believed in actions, and soon Marcus would see the consequences of his own. The tension in the restaurant had become impossible to ignore. Conversations had quieted, and more diners were casting furtive glances at Mrs. Kensington. Marcus, however, seemed oblivious, or perhaps emboldened, as he passed by her table again. She raised her hand politely. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice cutting through the murmurs around her. Marcus stopped, his expression tensing with impatience. "Yes?" he replied curtly, barely concealing his irritation. "Could I have my order now, if it doesn't take too long?" she asked, her elegance intact. Marcus let out a deep sigh, looking around him as if searching for an escape route. "I'll be back in a moment," he said in a low voice, turning before she could respond. At that moment, Elia got up from her seat, moving calmly and without haste. The atmosphere in the room seemed to transform as she passed. Her presence was imposing without the need to say a word. She reached Marcus just as the waiter was joking with another table. The arrogant look on his face quickly vanished upon noticing Elia standing by his side. Marcus stammered, trying to force a smile. "I didn't know you were—" "I've been here," Elia replied firmly. "I've been watching." Elia spoke calmly, but her voice conveyed unmistakable authority. "And I have been watching you ignore my mother, who has been sitting there for more than 30 minutes without even receiving a glass of water. Marcus's face lost all color. His gaze turned towards Mrs. Kensington, who was now sitting with poise, observing the scene with imperturbable calm. "You, your mother," stammered Marcus, his voice broken by surprise. "Yes, my mother," Elia replied with an even sharper tone. "The woman you have treated as if she were an inconvenience. The woman you believe did not deserve the same respect you have shown to all the other tables in this place." The restaurant was left in complete silence. All eyes were focused on them, including the pianist, who had stopped his melody halfway through, his fingers suspended over the keys. Marcus tried to open his mouth to defend himself, but Elia interrupted him. "Save your words," she said coldly. "There is no justification for what you have done, and everyone present has witnessed it." Elia turned to the manager, who had been hovering near the bar, hesitant about whether or not to intervene. "Dana," Elia said in an authoritative voice, "take care of table 12 and make sure my mother has everything she needs immediately." Dana nodded quickly and walked toward Mrs. Kensington, apologizing as she filled her glass with water and handed her a menu. Elia now looked at Marcus again, her face expressionless. "We'll talk about your future here later. For now, you're finished for today. Go home." Marcus stood motionless for a moment, his face reflecting a mixture of humiliation and remorse. Then, without saying another word, he took off his apron and left the restaurant, the heavy door closing behind him. The silence lingered for a moment longer until Elia approached her mother's table, bending slightly to meet her gaze. Her stern expression softened, adopting a warmer attitude. "You're all right, Mom?" Elia asked in a low voice. Mrs. Kensington smiled, stretched out her hand, and patted his hand. "I'm fine, son. You handled it with firmness." The tension that had built up in Elia's shoulders began to release. "I should have intervened earlier," he admitted. She replied softly, "You let him reveal his true character. Sometimes that has more power than confronting someone instantly." As the restaurant returned to its characteristic bustle, it became clear that what had happened would not be forgotten, nor the lesson it had brought with it. The atmosphere in the garden had changed. Conversations resumed their course, but the mood had become more reflective. The diners who had witnessed the scene now looked at Mrs. Kensington with a mixture of respect and silent admiration. Elia returned to her table, her face still calm, although the anger reflected in her eyes had not completely dissipated. Meanwhile, Dana, the manager, made sure that Mrs. Kensington's meal was served quickly. She herself presented the dishes, accompanying them with an apology so sincere that it seemed as if she were trying to correct the mistakes of the entire evening. Mrs. Kensington accepted the apologies with her characteristic composure, nodding slightly before concentrating on her food. She did not need grandiloquent gestures or speeches. Her serene dignity had already spoken for itself. At a nearby table, a young couple who had been observing the scene leaned toward each other. "I can't believe how she treated her," whispered the woman, shaking her head. "It makes you think, how many times does this happen, and nobody does anything about it?" Her companion nodded thoughtfully. "It's not just about what you see, but what you're willing to face when it happens." Elia listened to their conversation as she passed by their table on her way to where her mother was. The words of the couple accompanied her as she thought about all the times people like Marcus had escaped without consequences for mistreating others, just because no one was watching or cared enough to intervene. When he sat down next to her mother, he reached out and took her hand. "You have created something amazing here," Elia said softly. "But remember, a place like this is not just about the food or the ambiance, but about how people feel when they walk through those doors." "I know, Mom," he replied, choosing her words with regret in her voice. "I failed you tonight." She shook her head gently. No, you didn't. You gave everyone here the opportunity to see the truth, and you handled it with honor. That's what really matters." All around her, the staff seemed more attentive, the service more careful. It was no longer just a matter of avoiding another incident, but of the implicit lesson that Elia's actions had left in everyone. Respect and courtesy were not optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Mrs. Kensington finished her meal, she looked around the room. Her gaze stopped briefly on Dana, who offered her a small apologetic smile. There was no trace of resentment on her face, only a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the moment had left an impression. But for Elia, the lesson was not only for Marcus or the staff, it was also a reminder to himself that leadership did not only involve managing operations, but defending the principles that made her restaurant a truly special place. At the end of the evening, Mrs. Kensington prepared to leave with her usual calm. Elia accompanied her to the door, holding it open. As she stepped out into the cool night air, they stood there together for a moment, the warm light from the restaurant windows illuminating their faces. "You did well, son," Mrs. Kensington said, her voice softening, dispelling the tension built up during the day. Elia smiled with a slight melancholy. "I still wish it hadn't happened." She placed a hand on his arm. "What matters is what you said to them. You gave everyone there something to reflect on, something they will take with them. That is the real change." Elia nodded, watching as she made her way to the car waiting by the curb. Before entering, Mrs. Kensington turned and offered him a last smile. Inside the restaurant, the staff worked in silence, processing the events of the night, still fresh in their minds. Dana gathered the team for a brief meeting, adopting a serious but constructive tone. "What happened tonight is a wake-up call," she started, "not only about how we treat our customers, but about the culture we're fostering here. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, without exception." The staff nodded with serious faces. Marcus's absence was noticeable, a reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces professionalism. When Elia returned to the dining room, he took a look at the space that was beginning to empty. The events of the night still weighed on him, but they also reaffirmed his determination to make Le Jardin d'Elite something more than just a restaurant. It had to be a place where dignity and courtesy were served along with the best food. For the diners who had witnessed everything that night, it would remain etched in their memories. They had come in search of a unique dining experience, but they left with a story that reminded them of the power of respect, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the silent strength of those who refuse to allow injustice to define them. And to you who are reading this, ask yourself, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have raised your voice? Would you have remained silent and let everything happen? These moments are not always easy to recognize, but they are everywhere. Let what happened tonight serve as a reminder to you to always choose dignity and empathy. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe and share. It's through these conversations that we grow together.